The city never slept, but Alexander Sterling moved through it as though he owned every shadow, every breath of wind that whispered between the steel towers. Because in many ways he did. This is a story from Whispers of Kindness, where true compassion changes lives. At precisely 6:47 each morning, Sterling's Italian leather shoes struck the pavement in a rhythm so predictable that the street vendors could set their watches by it. His silver hair perfectly combed back, his charcoal suit without a single crease, his eyes fixed forward as if the world around him existed only as a backdrop to his empire, an empire built on numbers, strategies, and the calculated elimination of weakness, an empire that had cost him everything human and given him everything material. His mansion on the hill stood like a mausoleum of success, 40 rooms that echoed with emptiness, chandeliers that sparkled for no one, a dining table that seated 20 but only ever held one plate, one glass, one man eating in silence while financial reports glowed on his tablet screen. He had no family left, no wife who'd stayed, no children who'd forgiven him for choosing board meetings over birthday parties, no friends who weren't paid to laugh at his remarks, just lawyers circling like vultures, distant relatives he hadn't spoken to in decades suddenly sending Christmas cards, business partners making calculated compliments, all of them wondering, whispering, speculating about the $200 million question: who would inherit the Sterling fortune? That morning began like every other, the same route, the same pace, the same detachment, until a small figure stepped directly into his path near the fountain in Madison Square. A girl no older than 10. With tangled dark hair and eyes that held more wisdom than her years should allow, wearing a donated coat too large for her frame and clutching something in her small hands. Sterling's first instinct was annoyance, that familiar irritation when the world dared to interrupt his precision, and he moved to step around her, but she shifted too, matching his movement, and when he finally met her gaze, something in those eyes stopped him cold. Not fear, not greed, not the usual hunger he saw in everyone who approached him, but something else entirely. Something that looked dangerously like understanding. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady despite the autumn wind that whipped around them. "I'm Elara, and I know you don't know me, and I know you're busy, but I needed to tell you something important before it's too late." He should have walked away, should have signaled his security detail, should have done what he always did when the world tried to penetrate his fortress, but instead he heard himself say, "You have 30 seconds, and she smiled. Not the manipulative smile of someone wanting something, but a genuine smile that somehow made the gray morning seem less cold. "I don't want your money," she said. Holding out what he now saw was a simple pencil drawing of a tree with many branches. "I wanted to show you this. It's how Miss Clara at St. Catherine's Orphanage explains family to us. How one tree can shelter so many lives, and I heard the lawyers talking when they came to value the building last month, saying you might buy it and turn it into condos, and I thought maybe if I could just talk to you, person to person, you might understand that we're not just numbers on a property assessment, we're branches on a tree that somebody planted a long time ago, and maybe you have branches too, Mr. Sterling, branches you forgot to water." The drawing trembled in her hands, crude and childish yet somehow profound, and Sterling found himself not walking away but instead asking, against every instinct he'd honed over 50 years of ruthless business, "Where did you learn to talk like that?" And she said simply, "From losing everything. It teaches you what matters." What happened next would be discussed in boardrooms and society pages for years to come, analyzed and dissected, but no one would truly understand except the two people sitting in a modest corner cafe 20 minutes later, Sterling in his $1,000 suit looking wildly out of place among the worn vinyl booths, Elara with a hot chocolate she held like a treasure, while she told him about her world, not with pity or manipulation, but with the kind of honest storytelling that children possess before life teaches them to lie. She spoke of Marcus, who dreamed of being an engineer and built bridges from popsicle sticks, of little Sophia, who'd lost her parents in a car accident but still sang every morning, of teenagers who mentored younger kids instead of falling into the darkness that claimed so many foster children, of Miss Clara who worked 3 jobs to keep the orphanage running because the state funding barely covered utilities, of birthday parties celebrated with handmade cards and shared cupcakes, of homework done by flashlight when the electricity got shut off, of a community that understood something Sterling had spent his entire life forgetting, that wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the hands that hold you when you fall. We take care of each other, Elara explained, her eyes luminous with conviction. Because we know what it's like when no one does, and I thought maybe you knew that too, once, before you became the man who everyone wants something from instead of the man who wanted something from the world. Sterling felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the ice he'd built around himself, and he remembered suddenly, painfully, a boy who'd grown up in a 1-bedroom apartment with a single mother who worked nights, who'd sworn he'd never be poor again and had kept that promise but lost everything else in the keeping, who'd built his empire on the grave of his humanity and called it success. The hot chocolate sat untouched in front of him while Elara showed him photos on a battered phone. Children. Laughing, helping each other with homework, celebrating small victories, their faces glowing with something his mansion's chandeliers could never illuminate. And he realized with a vertigo that made his hands shake that these orphans, these children who owned nothing, possessed everything he'd spent his life trying to acquire and failed to find. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice rough with emotions he'd thought he'd surgically removed decades ago. "Why not go to the press, start a campaign, get celebrities involved?" And Elara looked at him with those 2 old eyes and said, "Because Miss Clara says that sometimes the people who seem the hardest are actually the most broken. And broken people understand broken people. And I thought maybe if I could just show you that you were not alone in being alone, maybe something would change. Not for us, but for you." He left the cafe in a daze, his routine shattered, his certainty crumbling, and for the first time in 30 years, he didn't go straight to the office, but instead walked without destination, seeing the city he owned as if for the first time. The homeless veteran by the subway entrance, whose sign asked not for money but for someone to remember his name. The exhausted nurse ending a double shift with kind eyes despite her weariness. The street musician playing saxophone not for tips, but for the pure joy of making beauty in a hard world. All these people living with grace and purpose, while he'd spent decades accumulating zeros in a bank account that would mean nothing when his heart finally stopped beating. That night, alone in his empty mansion, Sterling did something he hadn't done since he was young. He cried, not polite tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes from finally admitting you've been lost for so long you forgot what home felt like. And when the storm passed, he sat at his desk and pulled out the will his lawyers had crafted so carefully, the document that left his fortune to distant cousins and business associates in carefully calculated percentages, and he began to write something entirely different. The lawyers would call him crazy, would question his mental competence, would fight the changes with every legal tool available. But Sterling worked through the night with a clarity he'd never experienced in any business deal, restructuring his entire legacy not to build monuments to his ego, but to plant trees that would shelter branches he'd never see, establishing trusts for St. Catherine's and 100 orphanages like it, creating scholarships for children who'd known loss, founding counseling centers for families in crisis, not as tax write-offs or PR moves, but as a desperate attempt to redeem a life spent accumulating when he should have been connecting. He didn't do it for recognition. The trusts were structured anonymously, the funds to be distributed through foundations that would never bear his name. But for the first time since he was that poor boy in a 1-bedroom apartment, he did something that felt like purpose instead of profit. And the relief was so profound it made his decades of success feel like a prison sentence finally commuted. The will was changed, signed, and secured within a week. But what changed more dramatically was the man himself. Sterling still walked his morning route, But now he stopped to learn the names of street vendors, bought coffee for strangers, visited St. Catherine's not as a potential buyer, but as a quiet volunteer who helped with homework and never mentioned his last name. And when Elara saw him there the first time, she didn't act surprised, but simply smiled and said, "I knew you'd find your branches." And Sterling realized she'd given him something infinitely more valuable than he could ever give her. She'd reminded him how to be human. He died 2 years later, suddenly and without warning, a heart attack at his desk while reviewing reports from the foundations his money had seeded. And when the lawyers read the will to a room full of shocked relatives and business associates, there was uproar, contestation, accusations of manipulation, but the document was ironclad, and Sterling's fortune flowed out into the world like water finally released from a dam, changing thousands of lives, giving children like Elara not just financial support, but the message that they mattered, that their lives had value, that somewhere in the world, someone had chosen them over personal legacy. At his funeral, sparsely attended by the wealthy and powerful who felt betrayed by his final choices, a small group arrived separately. Elara and 20 children from St. Catherine's, wearing their best donated clothes, carrying handmade cards and that same pencil drawing of a tree with many branches, now laminated and treasured, and they stood together at his grave after everyone else had left and sang a simple song of gratitude, their young voices carrying across the cemetery like a benediction, like forgiveness, like the proof that one man's late-blooming awakening to compassion could echo far beyond his own mortality. Miss Clara, standing with her hand on Elara's shoulder, whispered, "You saved him, sweetheart." But Elara shook her head and replied with the wisdom that had started everything, "No, he saved himself. I just reminded him that he could, because sometimes one small act of courage, a child stepping into the path of a powerful man, a plea spoken not from need, but from recognition that we're all broken branches looking for a tree to belong to, can rewrite not just a will, but an entire life's meaning, transforming wealth from a measure of what you own into a testament of what you believe could matter in the world." What would you have done in Elara's place? Would you have had the courage to approach power with only truth and hope, trusting that somewhere beneath the armor every human has built, there's still a heart waiting to remember how to feel?